Once, during a conversation, a friend that I met not long before recited a line, a famous poem by one of the most famous Vietnamese poets of all time, who goes by the name of Han Mặc Tử. The line goes, Người đi, một nửa hồn tôi mất, một nửa hồn tôi bỗng dại khờ, which roughly translates to, with my love gone, half of my soul is lost, the other half suddenly becomes foolish. Now, to the me of the present, that is one of the most romantic poetry lines I've ever heard in my life. But back then, when I first heard the line, I honestly had no clue what it meant, even though it was clearly in my mother tongue. And I didn't even know it was from that poet, whose name rang a bell, but that was about it. Meanwhile, everyone else around me instantly recognized that line and started talking about how beautiful and moving it is. I was left feeling very confused. Another time, when I was talking to another Vietnamese friend, I asked them about this word that I've never come across before in my mother tongue, and they replied with, "Seriously? You really don't know what it means?" No, I didn't know what it meant, even though apparently it was a very commonly used word in my mother tongue. These are a few of the many moments that made me realize just how disconnected I am from my Vietnamese roots. It's not just a language problem. It's also the fact that I'm not well equipped with pop culture or basic cultural knowledge. And as a language and literature enthusiast, I felt ashamed and isolated and not Vietnamese enough compared to my peers. So, if you still can't tell by now, I'm Vietnamese, born and raised. The problem of losing touch with one's culture and language attrition, which is the process of losing one's first language, is one that many people can relate to, especially those who are first-generation immigrants, second-generation children, those who have dual citizenship, and those who are mixed. These people, understandably, struggle to maintain a relationship with their native culture as they are preoccupied and more familiarized with another culture. Yet, I cannot relate to these people, as I cannot use the same reasons to defend or excuse my failure to fully embrace my Vietnamese culture. I was born in Vietnam, and I have never lived anywhere else before coming to UK last year. I was raised in a fully Vietnamese household, and I do not have dual nationality, nor am I mixed. You would think that all of these factors would make up an ordinary teenager who's well acquainted with her own culture. Well, not really. I wouldn't be standing here talking to you all about it. They actually make up one of my biggest insecurities. It turns out, language attrition and losing touch with one's culture can also be seen in bilingual people and people who speak multiple languages. In my case, I attended a French school where I received a French education since the young age of 4, up until last year when I switched to the English education system. This means that throughout my life, I have always been surrounded by an international environment. In her poem, Search for My Tongue, the poet Sujata Bhatt says that if you lived in a place where you had to speak a foreign tongue, your mother tongue would rot and die in your mouth. Now, that is a rather grotesque and extreme way to put it, but we get the idea. A more simple way to explain this phenomenon can be expressed by Monica Schmidt, a linguist at the University of Essex, and she says that the moment you start learning another language, the two systems start to compete. I have 3 systems within me: Vietnamese, French, and English. And to me, they always seem to be competing. Now, with so much competition and chaos going on, it is easy to focus more on one part and neglect the other. And in my case, I have failed to properly nurture and take care of the Vietnamese in me. I got to learn the French language, about French history, French culture, and French literature at school, whilst I got to polish my English skills when talking to friends, watching films, and going on social media. As for my mother tongue and my native culture, I thought that being born in Vietnam, living in Vietnam, and communicating with my family in the bare minimum level of conversational Vietnamese was enough. Clearly, it wasn't, because as I grow older, I feel more and more humbled. You see, it is completely okay for me not to know a particular slang in French or a niche tradition in France, because at the end of the day, I am not French, nor have I ever lived in France. Similarly, it is also okay for me not to know a certain word or idiom in English, because at the end of the day, it is not my first language. Yet, it doesn't seem okay for me not to know, say, a famous Vietnamese historical figure, or popular expressions and slangs in Vietnamese, or all of the traditional Vietnamese holidays, because I am Vietnamese through and through, right? Aren't I supposed to know all of this basic common knowledge? And if I don't, am I even worthy of my Vietnamese identity? Now, I also just want to make it clear that I did not come to this identity crisis because of other people's expectations and opinions of me. Sure, sometimes they are surprised at my lack of understanding of my own culture, and they tease me for it. But what hit the hardest was self-realization. I felt embarrassed and disappointed at myself for having failed my Vietnamese heritage. And all of this only came to me recently, because as a child, you don't really think about these things or consider them seriously, because you perceive them as rather trivial or unnecessarily dramatic. In fact, in the past, there was a time in my life when I even looked down on other people who did not grow up in an international environment like I did, people who did not speak English, the universal language, as well as I did, people who did not speak as many languages as I did, people who were not as westernized. That was obviously a rather toxic and pretentious Eurocentric view, and the ironic thing was that I felt superior to other people because they didn't know a foreign language when I couldn't even master my first language. Thankfully, I still consider myself to be luckier than some people. Looking back, I have not completely lost touch with my roots, and I owe this to my parents. My parents hired a tutor to teach me Vietnamese when I was still 5 or 6, which led me to know how to read and write in Vietnamese with ease to this day. I know this might seem like not a big deal at all, but I know some people my age and even older still struggle with these basic skills. I also vividly remember my parents forcing me to read books in Vietnamese, and oh, how I despised them for that. But now, I am eternally grateful to them for their effort in shaping my Vietnamese identity. Which leads me to my next point on education. Education plays an imperative role. At home, parents cannot afford to be negligent. There should be early and consistent exposure to one's mother tongue and heritage. This can consist of practicing speaking, learning how to read and write, listening to music and other people talking, or read books, fairy tales, folk tales, and the list goes on. This is because children are most susceptible to acquiring habits and skills, and so this should be taught to them as soon as possible. If they're used to doing something, they won't feel the need and will have difficulty in learning to do it in the future. And when you've done something for so long that has become habituation, it is simply hard to change it. Do not let avoiding and being oblivious to one's roots become a habit. They say that you only come to cherish something when you're away from it. And for me, I long for and feel attached to my home and culture more than ever now that I am abroad to study. I'm filled with regrets for not making more effort to getting to know my culture sooner and better. And I know for a fact that many people worldwide come to the same realization as they get older. Especially being away from home, I come to see and appreciate the beauty and the different aspects of my Vietnamese culture that I've never noticed before, despite living there my entire life. For example, I never paid attention to how moving Vietnamese poetry can be, or how singing and listening to music in my first language hits way harder. Now, I'm always eager to learn more and tell people about unique Vietnamese traditions and foods, fascinating folk tales and legends, and even epic historical anecdotes. So, why am I telling you all of this? Why is it crucial to value and appreciate one's roots? My Vietnamese identity is unchangeable. It has always been and will always be with me for the rest of my life, no matter what I do or what I become, unlike how I acquired the Western culture, for lack of better words, throughout my life. Keeping in touch with my culture also helps strengthen the bond I have with my family and allows me to explore my very own existence. And I also simply want to be able to proudly celebrate this part of my identity. And when my friends here ask me about Vietnam and its culture, I want to be able to confidently tell them all about it instead of saying, I don't know, So, when immersed in another culture, one does not need to try to gain it because it just comes naturally. And as a result, one must be mindful and work to regain or maintain their native culture while being in another. I just want to put this out there. It is okay to not be fully Vietnamese or fully French or fully English. I'm not trying to call out or shame those who are just like me, those who feel disconnected from their roots, those who may not know their traditions or language well, those who may not know their history or literature well. We're all in the same boat, and I understand that this may be inevitable due to circumstances. However, what I do not think is okay is to disregard and ignore your cultural roots completely. One should make a conscious effort to connect with their roots, even if it means doing the littlest and the most seemingly insignificant things. I'm not obliging you to go home today and read books or listen to music in your native language if that's not your thing. But I do highly encourage you to try different ways, anything that, well, fits you, to gain a better understanding of your native culture and where you came from. It is never too late, and do it before you have any regrets. You can only acquire something once you're motivated and have the desire to do so. And I hope my story can inspire you or simply spark a reflection in you. Thank you.